have still not completed their active learning assignment for Module 4 will do that and send it to their course partner and their mentor for review. That would be great. Second, we have been uploading a number of really good resource documents onto the Moodle site. Some of them written by you, our participants, and some of them are just resource documents that participants have referred us to, such as Jarrett Bell and his Human Rights NGO. They posted a number of really interesting human rights education pieces on the Moodle site. So please check that out. Module 5 starts today and runs for 2 weeks until December 19th, by which time I hope everybody finds the time to complete their active learning assignment for Module 5, and then we'll take a holiday break until January 5th, when we'll reconvene for the last 3 modules, which are good governance, global peace and justice, and then a capstone module that we're working on trying to integrate all of these different topics and themes that we've been covering for the past couple of months. So let me say a few introductory remarks about the content in Module 5, and then I'm going to turn it over to our guest presenter today, Steve Mosley, who's the chair of the Advisory Council for the United Nations Association National Capital Area Group, and has done a lot of work on the new UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are going to become the focal point of our active learning assignment for Module 5. So Module 5 is intended to deepen our understanding of the global issue of poverty alleviation and income inequality, and how global citizens can address this issue within and across their countries. More than half of the world's 7 billion population lives on less than $3 a day, including 1.28 billion people who live on less than $1.25 a day, which is the UN definition of extreme poverty. These numbers actually used to be higher. Over the past decade, there's been a great deal of progress made in reducing poverty. Much of it has come in a small number of countries with high populations, such as China and other countries in East Asia, but also poverty has been significantly reduced in other countries as well. Bangladesh, Central Asian economies such as Uzbekistan, and Sub-Saharan Africa is also sharing in the progress. Sub-Saharan Africa broke through the threshold of a 50% poverty rate in 2008, and its number of poor people has begun falling for the first time on record. Hopefully, the current Ebola crisis in West Africa will not reverse that trend. The issue of income inequality goes hand in hand with the issue of poverty. The world's 500 richest billionaires, for example, their income exceeds that of the poorest 416 million people. Within most countries, income inequalities often are quite pronounced. For example, children born into the poorest 20% of households in Ghana or Senegal are 2 or 3 times more likely to die before the age of 5 than children born into the richest 20% of households. In the UK, the government's Scientific Reference Group on Health Inequalities found that life expectancy in the country's wealthiest areas is 7 to 8 years longer than in the poorest areas. Claire, I don't know whether you're familiar with that stat or not. Income inequality exists in many different forms. It includes global inequality, referring to inequality between individuals, irrespective of their nationalities. For example, 2 bus drivers from different countries. Inequalities between countries, focusing on mean income level country comparisons, and inequality within countries. Despite significant gains in eliminating extreme poverty, projections of up to 1 billion people living on less than $1.25 per day by 2030 paint a grim picture of our global future. While many programs have succeeded in lifting sections of the population above the extreme poverty line, the extreme poverty globally dropped from 1.9 billion in 1990 to 1.2 in 2010. Serious challenges threaten to slow progress towards poverty elimination. In many cases, individuals who escape extreme poverty remain extremely vulnerable to social and environmental catastrophes, as well as crises in their personal lives. The two main related approaches to alleviating poverty that are included in our module, and they are related. The first deals with macroeconomic development policies, and the second deals with making improvements in human capital. So in terms of macroeconomic policies, I'll say a few words about that, and then I'm going to ask Steve to comment more about the human capital dimension of poverty reduction. So economic growth has been proven to be the single most important factor influencing poverty alleviation. Economic growth usually is associated with a stable and sustainable set of macroeconomic policies that promote increased economic output and employment and minimize the risk of inflation. However, Brian Ames and colleagues at the IMF point out that every type of economic growth is not necessarily tied to a reduction in poverty. Rather, it's growth associated with progressive resource distributional changes that has the greatest impact on poverty in terms of an economic growth strategy. Therefore, macroeconomic policies that improve the distribution of income and assets within a society, such as land tenure reform, pro-poor public expenditures, and measures to increase the poor's access to financial markets are important elements in national poverty reduction efforts. To safeguard macroeconomic stability, the government budget, including the country's poverty reduction strategies, needs to be financed in a sustainable way. Poverty reduction strategies need first to be articulated, objectives and policies specified, then costed, and finally financed within the overall budget in a non-inflationary manner. Public sector expenditures in sectors such as education and health usually are a necessary but not a sufficient mechanism for promoting the kind of economic growth that reduces poverty. Studies show that capital accumulation and investment by the private sector is also needed to drive growth. Therefore, most countries need economic policies that enhance private sector investments, such as privatization of state-owned enterprises, banking and financial sector reform, reform of the regulatory environment for business. But while it's important to create a policy environment that spurs investment, it's equally important to have a policy environment in place that constrains private sector abuses of their investment practices at both a national and a global level. In a hyper-connected and interdependent world, macroeconomic policies in one country are affected by policies in other countries, as well as by global financial policies. An imbalance or a tipping point in one part of the world or one sector can send shockwaves rolling across the region of the planet, as witnessed in the worldwide impact of what started out as a U.S. mortgage and housing crisis in 2008. Therefore, when we speak of macroeconomic policies, we also need to include the need to ensure stable, transparent, and accountable global financial, banking, and investment policies. It should be noted that the new proposed UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2016 reflect a commitment to achieving economic growth that is equitable, economic growth for all, sustainable, and inclusive. The overall UN goal, new UN goal for the globe and within countries and regions is to achieve and sustain income growth for the bottom 40% of the population at a higher rate than the national or global averages, to increase opportunities for all and narrow the dramatic inequality and economic gaps between and within countries' populations. The new UN goals also call for new regulations and monitoring of global financial markets and institutions to meet these goals. So that's a very short summary of the macroeconomic approach to poverty reduction and income inequalities. Before moving on, or before taking questions, I'd like to ask Steve Mosley, who's our guest presenter, to speak to us for 10 or 15 minutes or so about the new UN Sustainable Development Goals, which really represent probably the most significant global policy aimed at improving human capital as a way to reduce poverty, and also to talk about the new active learning assignment for Module 5, which Steve helped to design. And then we'll take questions and comments. So, Steve?
Good. Ron, thanks very much. I'm really pleased to be with you, and I want to congratulate you, your colleagues, and the participants for having such a Global Citizen course. It's really very timely, I must say. I thought maybe it would be useful to go back a little bit in history, since we're about ready to move toward final debate and adoption of the new set of goals for the period 2016 to 2030, to go back just a little bit in time and remember, at least from my standpoint, maybe some of you will disagree, what a dramatic change it was to have the MDGs come into place starting in the year 2000. In the 20 years or so leading up to that period, while there was growth in development investment, economic growth, movement in many aspects of human development from the period of the 20 years leading up to that, and many countries were able to take advantage of it. Frankly, it left out most people, and the monies that were invested, both by countries and by many donors during that period, ended up not being concentrated in such a way to make maximal differences over time. And while I'm going to go and talk a little bit about how we're arriving at the new strategic development goals, but back in 1998 and 1999, leading up to establishing the MDGs, frankly, they were established by a very small group of 10 or 12 people. They were very capable people, thoughtful people, that had all attended the many global conferences around the world on gender equality, on population change, on certain aspects of economic change, and the Social Development Conference, I think, in 1985. And so they were drawing on a rich set of ideas and perspectives, but there wasn't any consensus building, frankly, to establishing the 8 goals that we know as the MDGs. I assume you've all spent most of your careers now over the last 15 years working within that framework, and my last 15 years of my career were very much guided by that framework. There's a lot of debate now. Is it so that the marvelous changes that I believe and some of the progress that has occurred under the MDG regime from the year 2000 up to now is significantly driven by the fact that many nations, many donors, many NGOs and CBOs fully concurred with and have been supporting and having their work channel their resources, their ideas, their experience along the lines of the MDG outcomes that were defined. Looking back, they seem simple, but they haven't been so easy to achieve, and indeed Ron's introduction reminded us that not everything's been achieved. But my view, contrary to some others, is that a great deal of this was achieved because there are common goals which the world, in effect, agreed upon. But I emphasize that they came about not with a broad consensus of many people making their views known, but just a relatively few people. Those were then adopted, actually, by the General Assembly. And since then, many different heads of state said, well, I never participated in defining those goals. Who decided on those goals? And so now, 15 years later, even though there's more evidence than not, I believe, that we've made progress, the question was, how do you bring the world into a process of setting new goals for the future beyond having a few people, generally men, in a back room attesting to where the world's people ought to envision going in the future. And so there's been a very, very, very different process over the last 2 years getting us to this point. This point is an interesting point. Today, or this week, follows finally, after 2 years of conversation, the Secretary General issuing what he called his synthesis report. We sent that to you, or at least I think we sent the link, in which he presented to the General Assembly last Thursday, I believe, or maybe it was even Monday of this week, last Thursday. His belief that we should go forward with all 17 goals that have been discussed and some 170 markers or measurable outcomes, even though now there needs to be a further debate for the coming year. But that list of goals came through some very interesting processes, which has involved over 2 million people in the world voting on what they believe are the priorities for development and economic growth. Those are registered now on a website called The World We Want. It's run by the United Nations Development Program, but it's a very open and transparent process. And frankly, at the end of your course, or sometime during this course, I hope that all the participants in the course, you will vote your preferences and your priorities into that scheme of votes from around the world. And the vote taking actually is calibrated according to different parts of the world geographically, different statuses of countries. So it's not just one vote fits all, but rather your vote can count within a perspective from where you sit and what you do and what your country's status is on some of the development goals. Ron referenced some of the progress that's been made on the MDGs, and in a sense they were relatively less complicated than the new goals that we're now facing and talking about. That's appropriate. I think we've learned a lot about how to channel our energies on a very concrete goal, for instance, in education. The goal was simply, primarily, to increase the access to education, make sure that children achieve a primary school education, a basic education, levels 1 through 7. And in many respects, the increase has been up to about 83% of kids are fully participating now in primary school. There's some question about its quality, and there's a lot more to do. The same can be true about good drinking water, healthy drinking water, where the achievement was over 2.3 billion people gained access over the last 15 years to drinkable water. On the other hand, sanitation, that is, sewage treatment, has not made the progress, even though that was also one of the goals. And the result is that the seepage of untreated sewage into the environment is also now, we realize, countermanding or counterbalancing the good progress that was made on children's health in terms of nutrition values being added to their diet. In fact, it's being eroded in part because we weren't able to achieve the other complex goal of enabling now the nearly 3 billion people in the world who don't actually have any access to regulated or controlled sewage. The result is that we have an uneven level of outcomes in terms of the MDGs. And the question is then, why were we able so successfully in some of them to achieve the measurable goal, and why weren't we? I don't think we have an absolute answer to all of that, but in the underlying comments that Ron made, I think there are two sets of key elements that have impeded, and I think this is what the countries and the discussants leading up to the new goals are saying, even though there isn't agreement whether or not they can be applied in the new goals. But one is the lack of good governance in many places. Clearly, even if you follow the precepts of economic growth policy, if you follow even a level of greater participation in government, inadequate leadership has shown us in many, many instances that can detract, derail, obviously, the progress. So good governance is increasingly recognized as a necessary condition. Good governance meaning also non-corruption, transparency, greater participation in arriving at decisions and approaches, and having an open, transparent monitoring available to the public within countries to measure what progress is being achieved and to be able, therefore, to have participation of people in their countries where these goals are being applied to help to change the direction in case they're not working. Likewise, conflict. There isn't a single country that's been in conflict at any significant stage during the last 15 years where the Millennium Development Goals were successful in being achieved. So conflict clearly is an impediment, and it's kind of obvious, but the other side of that is it's not so obvious. How can you build into the process of human and economic development attention to peace building? Not just keeping the peace as a UN force might do, or as NATO might try to do in a particular set of circumstances, or the African Union, as it's done in some places. But can you build into education? Can you build into public presence the processes which people are beginning to learn about to cause there to be dialogue and achievement of peaceful outcomes rather than conflict? If we don't, we now know clearly from the MDG process up to this point that coupled with poor governance, coupled with interventions of conflict, that it's not likely that we're going to be able to have perhaps even as much success as we believe we had with the goals under the MDGs. We also see that the economic changes, which Ron referred to, yes, GDP went up, healthy growth in most of the developing countries, faster than many of the developed countries. On the other hand, equitable growth, that is distribution of the opportunity to have jobs, distribution of rights, distributions of property rights, gaining assets on which people can rely. There's one person at the one of the global development centers here in Washington said that, while yes, poverty's been alleviated, 50% of those in extreme poverty have achieved a level of earnings, and not wealth by any means, but a level of earnings that goes beyond what had been considered the threshold for extreme poverty. On the other hand, they're hardly in a position to claim wealth or full participation in their economies. The director of that institution talked about them going from drowning to simply being on a skiff, hardly a boat or hardly on hard land, which gives them a process of being able to continue to build their lives. So the emphasis in the new goals is about equitable opportunity. It's about equal participation. It's about the opportunity to look at the larger context within which human development goals, very specific ones, and I'll get to those now, need to be addressed. They need to be addressed within an atmosphere that's focused on peace building and a context for continuing attention to the individual dignity of people. So much of the progress that's been made has been good for individual people, but it hasn't given rise to a full display of the opportunities that all people, especially disadvantaged minorities within countries, especially both rural people and the huge immigration of urban, former rural into urban settings. There's not attention to recognize that full population deserves dignity and ongoing investment and their full participation in the discussions of where these activities goes. Finally, with respect to the new framework, and I'll come back to some of the specifics, the goal of climate change, or the recognition that climate change is absolutely necessary to enable us to also have the opportunity to achieve the other goals has become far more apparent than even when the discussion began 2 years ago on how to arrive at the goals. So you'll see when you look at the list of 17 goals, 5 or 6 of them actually have disaggregated a general statement about the importance of climate change from the MDGs to now in the SDGs, the ones going forward for the next 15 years, give specific attention to not only gas reduction and through reduction in carbon use, which was the earlier definition, or the relatively simple but not achievable definition for climate change, to a very specific goal on the treatment of oceans, seas, marine resources, a separate one on ecosystems to manage forests, to combat desertification, land degradation, to focus as well on other aspects of water cleanliness, to ensure, in fact, that the whole realm of interrelated ecosystem issues that has an ultimate effect on climate change actually ends up in the new SDGs having almost the lion's share, at least in terms of numbers, among the goals. Another point I want to make is that in recognizing and measuring where we've come on the MDGs, it's clear that the groups establishing the new SDGs recognize that we still have a lot to accomplish under the previous MDGs. While we may have achieved particular aspects of achieving improvement in access and quality of education, or in water, or in reducing particular contagious diseases, in each of those areas, education, health, I'm still there, yes, I hit my mouse by mistake, excuse me, and in sanitation, and in hunger, and in food, and in terms of child mortality and maternal mortality, these new goals recognize that we're not dropping the old goals, but in fact refining and making more specific the addition of a number of other targets to be achieved within those categories. And I mention this because there's some misunderstandings among a number of governments as they've been debating this. Are we ending what we're doing in terms of our investment at the end of 2015 with the MDGs and simply starting over with a new set of goals? That's not the case at all. In fact, when you look at your list of 17 goals, for which you were also sent a document that summarizes them in 4 pages, and then we referenced yesterday in a document that refers to something called the Open Working Group document, which runs 33 pages, but it has contained in it with it a nice outline and a summary of the sub-goals. When you get to looking at those, which I think will be very helpful for the continuing conversation in this module of the course, you'll find that the 17 goals, the first 5 of them, poverty, hunger, healthy lives, quality education, gender equality, in fact, are 5 of the same 8 general goal titles from the MDGs. But don't be misled by that. I certainly urge you, go back and look within the new Open Working Group goals statement, the subcategories within each of those, and you'll find in each a proposed measurable target to be achieved. In each case goes considerably beyond where the former SDGs were headed. The same is true, though, the other goals, beyond the other, other 12 goals, introduce new titles, and within those, though, recognize are arguing fully. But when we focused, as we did during the last 15 years, when we achieved a consensus and an understanding among governments, among communities, among donors, and among those who work with donors in countries like NGOs, CBOs, when there's a common agenda and more or less a common perspective about what we're trying to achieve over time, there's likely to be the chance that we can achieve these much more complex goals in the future as well. But they are independent. And as you're now finding in this course and from your own work, tackling one issue without addressing the implications and the relationship with almost all the other issues makes it very hard to see how we can achieve and accomplish any one of the goals. So one of the challenges that the Secretary General set forth the other day in presenting now the preliminary list of those things that have been agreed upon, these 17 goals and the 169 sub-targets, is that the relationship among them is equally important as the list of things that we need to tackle. That is, if we don't become more multidisciplinary, if we don't, as development officials, as country leaders, as UN agency organizations, I'm an NGO person, spent most of my life working on activities in education and health and environment. If we don't step outside of our individual silos and understand and study carefully the interrelationships across each of these disciplines and these targets, we have probably very little chance of achieving what is now a much more complex agenda than we established for ourselves before. The people who participated in establishing this agenda include, of course, the representatives from each country around the world, 197 of them, I believe, at last count, have actually worked with a group of people, a group of 50 people who were appointed by the Secretary General, drawn from all different kinds of countries and different geographies. They, in turn, took testimony from most of the countries in the world, most of the representatives to the UN and others, and they held consultations in about 50 places around the world, and maybe some of you have participated in them. More recently, even in the United States, we've held some 30 consultations to engage both local CBOs, NGOs, local state leaders. And so now, in addition to the voting I mentioned before, there's a large buildup of understanding and, one could say, a consensus. It's not 5 billion people's votes, but when 2 million people have voted and there have been hundreds, literally, of consultations in different parts of the world, it's more likely than not that the list that's now been developed does reflect and can honestly be said with transparency to reflect some consensus about where we might consider and where we should go. Where are we in the process? In the next 9 months, 2 things will occur. This agenda, which was issued and widely circulated starting last Wednesday to all countries to now debate within and discuss, that will go forward. Not included in this agenda of list, though, as you will see, is very little attention given to how will this be paid for. What are the resources that will be necessary to bring to bear? Obviously, that's an important question. You've all dealt with the challenge of having lots of targets and opportunities, but little resources to accomplish it. There will be a significant summit based on another report, which we've not sent yet, but which you could access if you wish, in Addis Ababa in July. And that summit of all countries participating will, in fact, go through a process to debate and identify the range of resources from within countries, the new sets and goals of official development assistance, the expectation based on quite a number of meetings with business leaders around the world, including 200 who met with country leaders in Brazil 18 months ago, to unleash, as the Secretary General, the intention to unleash in a variety of ways investment for equitable industrialization development, unleash the trillions of dollars which are locked up in private sources and are invested, but not often invested with the full perspective that's set forth in these goals. So at the end of that, after that, by September of 2014, countries will meet and decide on the final list. The fact that they have already expressed an agreement with the open working group of representatives which met over the last year gives a high likelihood that this list, or a slightly modified list, will in fact be accepted and be voted on positively by the countries. New issues could come up. Some might be deleted. Some might be integrated, at least so we can communicate about them. But what you have in front of you, I think, is very exciting. That at this point in the course, you are now addressing the very issues which are front and center on the agenda of every country leader on earth. And I hope that this will make it more likely than not that the work you're doing and the assignment for this module, you can take advantage of their interest and recognition of this. Ron asked me finally to say something about the assignment. First, the assignment is to read some of these background documents. I know you don't have a lot of time, and we tried to pare them down, but I do strongly recommend that you read the longest one, which we sent out, and that is the Open Working Group document on the new Sustainable Development Goals, and we sent you the link to that. And you can read that fairly quickly. Probably only 15 pages of it need to be absorbed and see the sub-goals. The goals are all somewhat summarized in a 4-page document we sent. And just so that you are up to date, we did send the Secretary General's most recent statement in which he underlines the principles, even if there are disagreements on which goals to accept. He stresses which principles to follow, and we've talked already about most of those principles. The assignment, then, is relatively simple and straightforward, but it takes some effort. What we would suggest you do, since you have all such extraordinary professional backgrounds and work on either the existing goals or already working on some of these same goals, is to identify which one or possibly two goals are of greatest personal interest to you out of these 17 or out of the 16 after poverty alleviation. To one, review what you know and what's available in your setting, your country currently, about the current status or knowledge about the current status on which by the end of 2015 or as of now, in relation to the goals and the targets that have been set forth. In other words, simply to review what you know from the sources within your agency, from the sources in the literature within your country, from your own experience. Where do you now stand in relation to the one or two goals that you choose to focus on most for this assignment? Second, to write a brief description of that status, and in turn assess in your perspective how these one or two goals that you've chosen have an interaction with achieving the poverty alleviation goal, which is still the #1 overarching goal, and to discuss those links between the one or two goals you've chosen to focus on, whether it's health or education or inequality or gender, and relate those in turn back to the overall goals that are spelled out in the Open Working Group report on alleviating poverty. Whether that's about changing, has an impact on macro policy, but particularly what those, the focus on those other goals will do and how they will interact to address the bottom 40% of people where equity has not at all been achieved, and which is the target for the long-term outcome of the next 15 years. So there's an overview. I'll leave that in your hands, and I'll turn this back to Ron.
Steve, thank you so much. That was really a great introduction to everybody to the new UN Sustainable Development Goals, a topic that I think as global citizens we need to really be concerned about and involved in. And I want to reiterate your suggestion that that we visit the World We Want website and weigh in with our votes on the goals, and that in studying this assignment, each of the participants will be able to deepen their understanding of the process of the goals and how they relate to both the development of their own country and also to the other goals in the overall matrix of goals that the UN is putting forward. Many of us have been concerned about the linkages between the different goals and the linkages between the different modules in this course. So the assignment that you've designed, I think, is an excellent way for having us begin to explore the ways in which the different goals and the modules in our course interact and interrelate. So I'd like to ask anybody who's online now if they have any questions or comments for Steve, myself, about the assignment, about anything they want to weigh in. You can do it through chat, or you can come online and use your video function. Okay. Okay, so Chuck has weighed in with a comment. Do you see that, Steve?
I do.
Yeah.
I assume you're saying you don't want to have the combatants halt the efforts in those other places, although the misuse of polio vaccine in Pakistan certainly caused a row, unfortunately, with the aid and the assistance of our National Security Office. It's very clear that the conflicts in those places, less so in Nigeria, but Pakistan, Afghanistan, and many other places, is impeding it. And I belong to a group called the Alliance for Peace Building, and there's a group of countries that have banded together to agree to identify the markers or the indicators where peace needs to be shored up and conflict prevented. And this is something the United Nations is getting behind and causing some greater investment in, so that countries that have not reached a open civil war or open conflict actually can begin to take greater stock of the issues which could lead to that and address them earlier. So a kind of early warning system with measurable indicators, I think at least, is one way to begin to introduce conflict prevention early on in countries. On the other hand, situations we have in northern Nigeria and Afghanistan particularly indicate what happens when you don't address these early, and an enormous amount of effort needs to be done to achieve that. I don't have a full answer. All I can do is point you to some directions which at least offer some hope, and I'd also suggest you look at the Alliance for Peace Building website, which is a group of 80-some organizations on the ground who are trying to use some of these new tools for peace building. I'm looking at Claire Davis's comment. I haven't read the assignment yet, but that was really interesting. You should watch the video, taking notes. Okay, good. Where can we actually see the indicators that are under discussion? This is Ash Hartwell's question. The last link we sent you yesterday, which you can actually just Google UN Sustainable Development Goals, and a website, an active website, which the UN now operates, has on it all of the relevant reports. And the one I would suggest you look at specifically is called the Open Working Group Report. It was done issued in July or August of this year. And the Secretary General's statement just the other day reinforces that that's the document and that's the set of goals and underlying targets which he recommends the countries now debate leading up to their adoption. So look at the OWG report, the Open Working Group report, and you'll find in that also a description of their process, what the Open Working Group is. Let me just use Ash's question to underline another point. These are not set in concrete. There will be opportunity for change. And if during your assessment you want to recommend some changes, this is an opportunity to do so and to begin to feed into not only your country, but through this course to see if we can't take advantage of that through the United Nations Association, which I represent, feeding ideas and input for improvement of these goals and targets. It's not too late It will be too late by next September, because they'll begin to be very much set and voted upon, but now is the time to voice your opinion and to express your experience that could influence these. Vaughn, did you want to answer any of these questions while I'm looking at the next one?
No, I have my own question, so I'll wait. I think Ash has one more question about violence that he's chimed in on.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't mention reduction and prevention of violence, everything from urban crime to certainly violence against women, which is highlighted and is one of the specific goals now under the gender equality goal. That wasn't one of the goals earlier. And the rule of law, the fact, I should have put that within the description of good governance, you'll see in the sub-goal a reference specifically to rule of law. Having said that, though, I also want to say that probably the two areas that have had the greatest debate and where there is anticipated, perhaps, considerable disagreement from different factions within the United Nations will be around the three issues that are made clear in the document. They don't stand out as clearly. One is the emphasis on rule of law and good governance. You can imagine that there's some governments who don't particularly believe that the development goals sequence ought to be placing burden on them about their governance. Second, there are issues surrounding women's rights, particularly reproductive rights, that are made very clear and quite explicit in two parts of the goals, one under gender and one under health. Those are being debated with a great deal of energy. And the third is about peace building. There are those factions within the United Nations who don't believe that the development agenda should be modeled or linked to what many consider obviously a political and security issue, not a development issue. And those who are in favor of doing this are really recommending for the first time we must link these issues together. I'm looking at this message. It looks like it's from the admin user. Is that Ron?
Yeah, that's me.
Well, you'll see in the last goal called partnerships, and the last goal in the MDGs was also called partnerships, but it had very little description of what that meant other than we must all partner together and find new ways to achieve these goals. In the new set of goals, there's a much more pointed and additional set of ideas put forth on finding new ways to partner. And for the first time, this very process put NGOs and community-based organizations at the table with each of the major commissions that has led to the list we have in front of us today. There's been very strong participation by NGOs and CBOs, and the document clearly states that the United Nations sees NGOs and local communities as partner implementers and definers of what will need to be achieved. That wasn't so in the earlier MDG document. There was, I don't recall, any significant reference to NGOs, and they certainly weren't in the room, and they certainly weren't at the table for defining what the goal should be. Now they are, and that's probably the most significant change that's happened at the UN. I attended a 4-day conference at the UN in August of NGOs with high level, the very highest levels leaders of the UN. They welcomed having the NGOs in their space, in their rooms, in the General Assembly room, in the security room, to talk about these development goals and how they see a partnership evolving. Very encouraging. I don't see any other questions at the moment.
No, I think, well, Chuck has one more question about focus on linking the goals to national security.
Well, except in the peace-building sense. National security cuts both ways. There's an evil side of national security, as we've come to realize. I don't think this is intended to link it to national security, except in the peace sense. There isn't any aspect of the goals, at least that I remember reading, that links the goals to the capacity of a national defense capacity to achieve any of the development goals, as we might do in relief work. Although in some sense that's not really addressed within these goals, how to take advantage of national security apparatus to support that. But I do think there is a very strong interest in trying to achieve a new definition of peace building and have much more emphasis on peace building than just peacekeeping, which is put in the largest single force, armed force in the world today in the field is the United Nations peacekeeping forces. There are 135,000 such people now working in, I think, 19 countries. The key here, and what this document is trying to get at, is what you do long in advance of the need to send in peacekeepers. What can you do at the community and the national level? I'll use as an example Kenya, the process by which people after the conflicts there several years ago, community-based organizations, NGOs, fostered dialogue in a way that had never occurred before in a country at the national level following the disagreements with the outcome of an election. And it has sustained a level of peaceful progress since then. So it's a good example. Thank you, Chuck.
Okay, Steve, so I want to thank you for an excellent presentation and for joining us for Module 5. I think you're going to participate in at least one of our mentoring sessions that's going to take place in a week. And then a week from Wednesday, I think that's December 17th, at 8 a.m. New York, Boston time, we'll have our online learning exchange where participants will have a chance to share the work they've been doing in response to the assignment that Steve has given us. So hopefully if you're available you could join us for that, and we welcome your input. And I want to thank everybody who participated today. For those of you who didn't, excuse me, we're uploading the module onto the Moodle site, and people can download it probably within the next couple of hours. So thank you very much. Have a great day, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you for including me.